The rain had barely stopped falling when the first black SUV appeared on the horizon, its sleek body cutting through the muddy road like nothing the villagers had ever seen before. Then came the second one, and then the third, all moving in a slow, deliberate procession toward the heart of the village. Mama Adaze was the first to notice them from her vegetable stall, and she dropped. Adaze was the first to notice them from her vegetable stall, and she dropped the tomatoes she was arranging because cars like these did not come to places like this, not ever, not unless something terrible had happened or someone important had died. Within minutes, the entire village seemed to freeze as the vehicles came to a stop near the old mango tree at the center of the community. Doors opened simultaneously, and men stepped out. Men wearing suits that cost more than most families here earned in an entire year. Suits so clean and pressed that they seemed to belong to another world entirely. The villagers gathered at a distance, mothers pulling their children close, elders squinting through tired eyes. Everyone whispering the same questions to each other. Who are these people? What do they want here? Has someone committed a crime? The men looked around slowly, their eyes scanning the crowd with a calm intensity that made hearts beat faster. Then the one who appeared to be in charge, a tall man with graying temples and gold-rimmed glasses, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried across the silence. He said they were looking for a boy. A young boy named Kofi, a boy who had helped an old man find his way home during the storm the previous night. The whispers grew louder now, more confused than before. Kofi? Little Kofi who sells water at the market. The skinny boy who lives with his widowed mother near the cassava farm. What could these powerful men possibly want with a child like him? Across the village, in a small house made of cement blocks and a rusted iron roof, a woman named Abina heard the commotion outside and felt her blood run cold. She recognized her son's name being spoken by neighbors rushing past her door. She grabbed her wrapper and ran outside, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum of war. And when she saw the black vehicles and the men in suits walking in the direction of her home, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. She thought of every terrible possibility at once. Had her son stolen something? Had he offended someone powerful? Had he been falsely accused of a crime he did not commit? She knew her boy, knew him better than she knew her own reflection, and she knew he would never do anything wrong. But the world was not always fair to people like them, to poor people, to people without connections or protection. She positioned herself at the entrance of her compound, her arms spread wide, ready to defend her child with her own body, if necessary. Kofi appeared behind her, a thin boy of 14 with curious eyes and his father's quiet strength, and he placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, as if to calm her, even though he too did not understand what was happening. The men approached, and the village held its breath, and in that moment nobody could have predicted that what was about to unfold would change everything forever. Not just for this boy and his family, but for every single person watching. This is the story of how one small act of kindness during a storm brought a miracle that nobody saw coming, and it begins not with the arrival of these men, but with the life of a boy who had nothing and yet possessed the greatest wealth of all. To truly understand what happened on that stormy night and why it mattered so much, you first need to understand where this story takes place and who Kofi really was before the world came knocking at his door. The village sat on the forgotten outskirts of the city, far enough that the streetlights and paved roads and running water of the urban center seemed like luxuries from a distant dream. Here, the roads turned to red dust in the dry season and thick, unforgiving mud when the rains came. Houses were modest structures of cement, wood, and iron sheets, some painted in fading colors, others left gray and weathered by time. Electricity was unreliable, flickering on and off without warning, and most families still cooked over open fires and fetched water from a communal well that had been there longer than anyone could remember. It was the kind of place that politicians visited only during election season, making promises they would never keep. the kind of place where children grew up fast because survival demanded it. Yet, despite its poverty, the village had something that many wealthier communities lacked, and that was a deep sense of togetherness. A culture of respect for elders, a belief that neighbors were extended family, and that kindness was not optional, but essential. It was in this environment that Kofor was born 14 years ago, the first child of Abina and her husband Quaim, a hard-working man who had labored in the mines 2 towns away to provide for his family. Quaim was not an educated man, but he was wise in the ways that mattered, and he taught his son from an early age that a man's character was his most valuable possession. He would sit with young Kofi in the evenings after returning from work, exhausted but never too tired to share a lesson, and he would say things that the boy carried in his heart long after the words were spoken. He told Kofi that money could be stolen, but integrity could not, that the way you treated people who could do nothing for you revealed who you truly were, that respect for elders was not just tradition but sacred duty. Kofi absorbed these teachings like dry earth absorbing rain, and they became part of who he was at his very core. Then came the tragedy that changed everything. Kofi was 10 years old when his father fell ill, a sickness that started as a cough and grew into something the local clinic could not treat. They did not have money for the hospital in the city, did not have connections to doctors who could help, and so Abina watched helplessly as her husband faded away over the course of 3 agonizing months. Quaim died on a quiet morning with his family around him, and his last words to his son were simple but profound. He told Kofi to take care of his mother and his little sister Amma, who was only 4 at the time, and he told him to never forget that being a good man was more important than being a rich man. Kofi promised, holding his father's rough and calloused hand, and from that day forward, he carried the weight of that promise on his young shoulders. The years that followed were difficult in ways that only those who have experienced true poverty can understand. Abina took work as a washerwoman, walking long distances to the homes of wealthier families where she spent hours scrubbing clothes by hand, returning home in the evenings with her back aching and her hands raw, but with just enough money to buy food and keep her children in school. Kofi, understanding his family's situation with a maturity beyond his years, began working as well. He would wake before dawn to help his mother with household chores, attend school during the day with fierce determination, and then rush to the market in the afternoon where he sold small items to travelers and locals. Some days, he sold sachets of water. Other days, he sold roasted groundnuts or phone credit. And on good days, he made enough to contribute meaningfully to the family's income. His little sister, Amma, now 8 years old, was a bright and joyful child, despite the hardships she had witnessed, and Kofi felt a fierce protectiveness over her, determined that she would have opportunities that their circumstances threatened to deny. What made Kofi remarkable was not just his work ethic but his character, the way he carried himself in a world that had given him every reason to become bitter or selfish. Despite having so little, he was known throughout the village and the market for his generosity and kindness. Traders would watch him share his small lunch with children who had none, giving away food when he himself was hungry. They saw him help elderly customers carry their purchases without being asked, refusing tips with a polite smile. They noticed how he always greeted his elders with proper respect, bowing slightly, using the right titles, showing a deference that many young people had abandoned in these modern times. There was a blind man named Papa Mensa who came to the market often, and Kofi had made it his personal duty to help this man navigate the crowded spaces, guiding him by the arm, making sure no one cheated him when he made purchases. There was a widow named Mama Fasua who sold groundnuts at a stall near his, and whenever her sales were slow and she worried about feeding her grandchildren, Kofi would secretly direct customers her way, sacrificing his own potential earnings for her benefit. These were not grand gestures that attracted attention or praise, just small acts of goodness woven into the fabric of his daily life, invisible to most but deeply meaningful to those who received them. Kofi himself never saw anything special in his behavior because to him it was simply normal. simply what his father had taught him, simply what his mother expected, simply what felt right in his heart. He had dreams like any other boy his age, and his biggest dream was to become an engineer one day. He loved watching construction projects in the city when his mother took him there occasionally, loved seeing how buildings rose from nothing, how bridges connected places that were once separated, how roads opened up possibilities for entire communities. He would study mathematics with extra dedication, borrowing textbooks from older students, practicing problems by candlelight when the electricity failed, believing that education was his only pathway out of poverty and to a life where he could make a difference. He kept a small notebook where he sketched designs for inventions he imagined, things that could help his village, like a better water pump or a solar-powered light that never went out. It was the dream of a child who had nothing but could see beyond his circumstances to a future filled with purpose. There was one possession that Kofi treasured above all others, more than the worn school bag his mother had saved for months to buy him, more than the single pair of good shoes he kept clean for church on Sundays. It was his father's watch, an old wristwatch with a cracked face and hands that no longer moved. Quaim had worn this watch every day of his working life, and when he died, Abina had given it to Kofi as a keepsake. The boy wore it always, even though it could not tell time, even though other children sometimes laughed and asked why he wore a broken watch. To Kofi, it was not about telling time, but about keeping his father close, about carrying a piece of Quaim's spirit with him through every challenge, about remembering the lessons and the love that shaped who he was. When life became hard, when hunger made his stomach ache, when exhaustion made his body weak, Kofi would touch that watch and remember his father's voice telling him to keep going, to stay good, to never give up. This was Kofi on the day before the storm, an ordinary boy living an ordinary life in an ordinary village unknown to the world, beyond his small community, possessing nothing of material value, but carrying within him a richness of character that money could never buy. He had no idea that the following 24 hours would transform his existence completely, no idea that a chance encounter in a storm would ripple outward in ways he could never imagine, no idea that the kindness his father had planted in him as a seed was about to bloom into something miraculous. As he closed his market stall that afternoon and looked up at the darkening sky, feeling the first cool winds that signaled the coming storm, Kofi simply thought about getting home safely to his mother and sister. He had no way of knowing that destiny was about to place someone in his path, someone who needed exactly the kind of help that only a heart like Kofi's was prepared to give. The first light of dawn had not yet broken through the darkness when Kofi's eyes opened, as they did every morning, trained by years of responsibility to wake before the sun itself. He lay still for a moment on the thin mattress he shared with his little sister, Amma, listening to her gentle breathing and the distant crow of a rooster announcing the approaching day. The room was small and simple, with walls that held cracks like the lines on an old man's face, and a single window covered with thin curtains his mother had sewn from old fabric. Kofi rose quietly, careful not to disturb Amma, and folded his sleeping cloth with the precision of someone who valued the little he possessed. In the next room, separated only by a faded curtain, he could hear his mother, Abina, already awake, preparing for her long day of washing clothes for families who had more than they could ever dream of having. Kofi stepped outside into the cool morning air, grabbed the 2 yellow jerry cans that sat by the door, and began his walk to the community well 3 streets away. The path was familiar, every stone and pothole memorized by his bare feet, and he nodded respectfully to the few early risers he passed along the way. At the well, he waited his turn behind 2 older women, greeting them properly as his father had taught him, using the traditional titles of respect that made them smile at his good upbringing. He filled both containers, lifted them with arms that had grown strong from years of this routine, and carried them home where his mother would use the water for cooking, cleaning, and bathing. This was how every day began for Kofi, with duty and purpose before his own needs, with service to his family before thoughts of himself. By mid-afternoon, Kofi had finished his classes and rushed to the market to begin his second job of the day, the one that helped put food on his family's table. His stall was nothing more than a small wooden table and a plastic basin filled with sachets of pure water, packets of biscuits, and phone credit cards that he sold to passers-by. The market was a symphony of sounds and colors, traders calling out their prices, customers haggling with theatrical passion, children weaving between stalls playing games, and the smell of fried plantains and roasted corn filling the air. Kofi had learned to navigate this world with skill, knowing which customers wanted conversation and which preferred quick transactions, understanding when to negotiate and when to hold firm on his prices. But what truly set him apart from other young traders was something that had nothing to do with business sense. An elderly woman approached his stall that afternoon, her wrapper faded and her feet dusty from walking, and she asked the price of water with a voice that trembled with thirst and exhaustion. When Kofi told her, she counted her coins with shaking hands and realized she was short, and the embarrassment on her face was painful to witness. Without hesitation, Kofi handed her 2 sachets and refused her incomplete payment, telling her that today the water was free, telling her that elders should never have to beg for something as basic as water. The woman blessed him with prayers that came from the depths of her heart, calling him a child of light, and Kofi simply smiled and wished her well. Other traders watched this exchange, some thinking him foolish for giving away his profit, others recognizing in him something rare and precious that this harsh world had not yet managed to destroy. The sky began to change around 4 in the afternoon, the bright blue transforming into an angry gray that spread across the horizon like a bruise forming on skin. Kofi noticed the shift in the air, the way the wind picked up suddenly and carried with it the unmistakable smell of coming rain, that earthy petrichor that announced storms in this part of the world. Around him, the market responded with practiced urgency, traders covering their goods with plastic sheets, customers hurrying to complete their purchases, mothers calling for children to come home immediately. The radio at the electronics stall nearby crackled with a weather warning, the announcer's voice serious as he spoke of a severe storm approaching, advising everyone to seek shelter and stay indoors until it passed. Kofi began packing his remaining items into his worn backpack, calculating in his mind how quickly he could reach home before the rain began its assault. He had made reasonable sales today, enough to give his mother something meaningful, and he felt the small satisfaction of contribution that always warmed his chest. The first drops fell as he secured his bag, fat and heavy drops that splattered against the dusty ground and created tiny craters in the red earth. Then the sky seemed to open completely, and rain poured down with a ferocity that turned the world into a blur of water and noise. Kofi ducked under the nearest shelter, a rusted awning outside a closed shop, and watched as the storm transformed the market street into a rushing river within minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by thunder so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. He knew his mother would be worried, knew Amma would be frightened of the thunder, and he made the decision to brave the storm and run home. He had barely stepped out from under the awning when he saw the old man, and something about the sight made him stop despite the rain soaking through his thin shirt. The man sat alone at a bus stop that had no bus coming, no shelter overhead, just a broken bench exposed to the full fury of the storm. He was drenched completely, his clothes clinging to a frail frame, his gray hair plastered to his head, and even from a distance, Kofi could see that something was wrong. The man looked confused, lost, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he did not recognize where he was, his lips moving in words that the rain drowned out. Other people rushed past the bus stop without stopping, too focused on their own urgency to notice the elderly figure sitting there like a forgotten statue. Kofi watched a young man run past the old man without a glance, watched a woman with an umbrella hurry by on the opposite side of the street, watched a group of traders pass with goods balanced on their heads, all of them blind to the vulnerable soul in their midst. Something stirred in Kofi's heart, something that felt like his father's voice speaking directly to his conscience. He thought about home, about his worried mother, about the warmth and safety waiting for him there. He thought about the storm's danger, about the flooding streets and the lightning that continued to crack overhead. And then he thought about this old man, alone and helpless, and he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. He walked toward the bus stop, rain streaming down his face, and when he reached the old man, he knelt down to eye level and spoke with gentleness and respect. He said, "Grandfather, are you all right? The storm is very bad." And the old man looked at him with eyes that seemed to clear slightly at the sound of a kind voice. The old man's voice was weak and confused as he tried to explain his situation, his words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence, his hand gesturing vaguely in a direction he could not seem to identify. He mentioned a street name, a house with a blue gate, and Kofi recognized the description as a neighborhood on the other side of the market area, at least 30 minutes away by foot in normal conditions, much longer in a storm like this. The sensible thing would have been to help the man find temporary shelter and leave him there, to save himself and let adults handle the situation. But Kofi looked at the old man's trembling hands, saw the vulnerability in his aged eyes, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He removed his backpack and placed it securely on his back, then helped the old man rise slowly from the wet bench, supporting his weight with young shoulders that accepted the burden without complaint. He pulled out the torn umbrella he always carried, a thing held together more by hope than by functionality, and positioned it over the old man's head, leaving himself exposed to the rain. Together, they began to walk, step by careful step, through streets that had become streams and past buildings that loomed like shadows in the gray downpour. The old man leaned heavily on Kofi, his feet uncertain on the slippery ground, and several times the boy had to catch him from falling, had to steady him with patience that seemed beyond his years. They stopped frequently under whatever shelter they could find, a shop awning here, a tree there, waiting for the old man to catch his breath before continuing. During one such stop, the old man turned to Kofi with something like wonder in his eyes and asked why. Why was this boy helping a stranger when everyone else had walked past? Kofi's answer was simple and honest, delivered without any expectation of praise or reward, spoken as naturally as breathing. He said that his father had taught him to respect elders, that his mother had raised him to help those in need, that he could not walk past someone who was suffering when he had the ability to offer assistance. The old man listened carefully, studying the boy's face as if memorizing every feature, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked like recognition of a rare and precious quality. They continued their journey through the storm, the old man occasionally asking questions about Kofi's life, about his family, about his dreams for the future. Kofi answered openly, sharing stories of his late father, his hard-working mother, his beloved sister Amma, his hope of becoming an engineer someday. When they finally reached the street the old man had described, when they stood before a modest house with indeed a blue gate, the old man seemed to fully return to himself, his confusion lifting like fog in morning sun. A woman opened the door, her face transitioning from shock to relief to tears in seconds, and she pulled the old man inside while exclaiming about how worried everyone had been, how they had searched everywhere. She tried to press money into Kofi's hands, a substantial amount that would have meant weeks of income for his family, but the boy refused politely and firmly. The old man insisted on knowing his name and where he lived, and Kofi provided this information before disappearing into the storm, running toward home with the satisfaction of having done right. He arrived at his house soaking wet and shivering, to a mother whose worry transformed into embrace, who listened to his story with pride shining through her tears. Morning came with sunshine that seemed to mock the violence of the previous night, bright and warm as if the storm had been nothing but a dream. Kofi woke with a headache and a slight fever, his body's protest against the hours spent in cold rain, but he rose anyway because there was work to be done and his family depended on him. His mother forced him to drink hot tea with ginger and honey, her remedy for all ailments. And his sister Alma looked at him with admiration as their mother retold the story of his kindness to the lost old man. By mid-morning, Kofi felt well enough to prepare for the market, his sense of duty stronger than his physical discomfort. And he was gathering his supplies when the first unusual sounds reached their small house. Voices outside grew louder, neighbors calling to each other, footsteps hurrying past their door, and beneath it all, the rumble of engines that did not belong to any vehicle commonly seen in this village. Kofi stepped outside to investigate and saw people gathered at the edges of the main path, all staring in the same direction, all wearing expressions of confusion and concern. 3 black SUVs were making their way slowly into the village, their polished surfaces reflecting the sunlight. Their presence is foreign in this dusty community as spaceships from another planet. Men in suits emerged from these vehicles, their clothing immaculate, their bearing speaking of power and importance, and they began asking questions of the gathered villagers. Kofi heard his own name carried on the wind, heard neighbors pointing in the direction of his home, and a cold fear began to form in his stomach. What had he done wrong, he wondered? What trouble had found him despite his best intentions? What price would he now pay for simply trying to help? His mother appeared beside him, having heard the commotion, and when she saw the men in suits walking toward their home, her face became a mask of protective determination. She positioned herself in front of Kofi, her body a shield, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes as she addressed the approaching men. She said that they were simple people, poor people, that whatever they thought her son had done must be a misunderstanding, that he was a good boy who had never caused trouble in his life. The lead man, tall with graying temples and an air of authority, raised his hand gently and smiled in a way that softened his intimidating presence. He explained that Kofi was not in trouble, quite the opposite in fact, that the boy had done something extraordinary the previous night and that someone very important wished to thank him personally. Confusion replaced fear on the faces of mother and son, on the faces of all the neighbors who had gathered to witness this unprecedented scene. Then another vehicle arrived, sleeker than the others, and from it emerged the old man from the storm, transformed completely from the helpless figure of the previous night. He was dressed now in expensive traditional attire, surrounded by aides who treated him with obvious deference, and he walked toward Kofi with arms open and eyes shining with emotion. The lead man announced that this was Mr. Emmanuel Okonkwo, founder of one of the largest construction companies in the nation, a billionaire philanthropist whose name was known across the continent. This was the man Kofi had helped in the storm, the man who had been suffering an episode of confusion related to a medical condition, the man who might have died exposed to the elements if not for a poor boy with a rich heart. Mr. Okonkwo embraced Kofi as if he were a long-lost family, holding the thin boy against his expensive clothes without concern for appearances, speaking words of gratitude that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. He told the gathered crowd that he had met presidents and kings, that he had dined with the wealthy and powerful of many nations, but that he had never encountered anyone with a heart as pure as this child who had nothing yet gave everything. He explained that his condition sometimes caused him to become disoriented, that he had wandered away from his car and driver, that he had been lost and frightened and cold until an angel in the form of a poor boy had appeared to guide him home. Then Mr. Okonkwo announced what he intended to do, and the village fell into stunned silence. He declared that Kofi would receive a full scholarship to the best schools in the country, from now until he completed university, with all expenses covered including books and housing and living costs. He declared that Kofi's sister would receive the same gift, that their mother would receive a monthly stipend that would free her from washing clothes. For others, that a new home would be built for the family right here in the village. But he was not finished speaking. He said that Kofi's character did not develop in isolation, that this village and its values had shaped him, and therefore the entire community would share in the blessing. He announced the construction of a proper school with qualified teachers, a health clinic with real medical equipment, a water system that would bring clean water to every home, and employment opportunities for anyone willing to work. 1 year later, the village was barely recognizable to those who had known it before, transformed not just in its physical structures, but in its spirit and its hope for the future. Where there had been a crumbling building serving as a school, there now stood a modern facility with bright classrooms and a library filled with books that children touched with reverent wonder. The clinic served not just this village but surrounding communities as well, saving lives that would have been lost to preventable diseases and treatable conditions. Clean water flowed from taps in every compound, ending the daily struggle of carrying heavy containers from distant wells. And at the center of it all was Kofi, now 15, thriving in his new school, excelling in mathematics and science, moving steadily toward his dream of becoming an engineer. His father's watch, once broken and silent, now ticked faithfully on his wrist, repaired as a gift from Mr. Okonkwo, who understood its true value. But what had not changed was Kofi's heart, still quick to help those in need, still respectful to elders, still generous despite now having more than he had ever imagined. He understood something that many people never learn, that his blessing had come not because he had expected it, but precisely because he had not. That kindness must be its own reward, or it becomes something else entirely. When people asked him what lesson others should take from his story, his answer was always the same. He would say that you should help people not because of who they are, but because of who you are, not because of what you might receive, but because of what you have to give, not because it is easy, but because it is right.